Today we're going to start to create something amazing. Giant-sized candy or conversation hearts. Conversation hearts can only be found starting from January 1st all the way to Valentine's Day. They're made by the company called Necco. We're going to learn how Necco originally began creating conversation or candy hearts. They've been doing so for well over 100 years. I also thought it'd be fun to go on an adventure to learn about other artists who are inspired by things that they see in their everyday lives. Those are called pop artists or popular culture inspired artists. That's going to be our inspiration, popular culture, when we go on our amazing adventure of creating these giant-sized candy or conversation hearts.
The ingredients are first measured very carefully. Sugar, cornstarch, and flavors are poured into a very large mixer and are mixed together until they form a dough. The dough is then flattened into sheets, and once they have those sheets created, sayings are stamped onto the sheets before the hearts are punched out. Once dry, the hearts are then all mixed together and placed inside those very special boxes. Before we create our own giant-sized candy hearts, let's take a look at some other artists. For example, Julia Chang, who creates text with candy, as does Tanya Schultz, making beautiful installations. But my favorite artist is Peter Anton, who creates huge food sculptures. Let's start on our own.
Your first step to making your candy heart sculpture is to create something called an armature. An armature is the underneath support of a sculpture. Our armature is going to be made from what looks like paper, but it's actually something called tag board. It's a little bit thicker than paper. Poster board would work just as well. I cut a piece of tag board that's 2 inches wide, 24 inches or 2 feet in length. And my first step, now that I have my piece of tag board that's 2 inches wide and 24 inches in length, is to fold it in half. And once I've got it folded in half, making sure I've matched up my edges, I'm going to take the ends and just kind of bend it in. You can already see that the bottom is resembling the bottom of a heart. So I need to make the 2 curves at the top. So I'm bending this in a little bit, and you can already see it starts to look like a heart. The problem is it wants to keep coming apart. So you need to secure it. We're going to do that with staples. So I'm going to hold it still and pinch it. You might even need to have a friend help you pinch this. And once you've got it pinched in place, you're going to lift it up and out so that you have a place to slide your stapler. Then you'll do the same thing on the opposite side. So I'm adding 2 staples, and that will secure the heart shape. Now that's finished, I'm ready to make the top and the bottom of the heart. So for that, I'll need more tag board. In fact, I've got 2 pieces, one for the top, one for the bottom, and I'm even using some recycled pieces of tag board. Since you're going to be covering it, it can even be old used pieces of tag board or a poster board. I'm going to take both of my pieces together, and I am going to put my heart not right in the middle because, hello, I'm not saving very much paper. But if I put it over to the edge, get it really close to the edge, then I could possibly save this tag board for making something else. So here's the tricky part. You need to trace this heart, but it's not stable. So when you're tracing it, the key is, so that it doesn't wobble on you as you're tracing, to take your hand, spread it out, and push down really firmly on the heart. And that will stabilize it just enough for you to trace it. And when you're tracing, another key is to not press very hard with your tracing pencil or Sharpie. If you press really hard, you're going to move the heart in, which will change its shape. So you want to maybe just press gently, just enough so that your Sharpie or pencil knows where to trace. So I'm just barely pressing in. Might even help to stand and move around or have a friend press really hard on this heart. I'm pressing firmly to make sure to hold it in place so it doesn't wiggle. Done. Now that I've got this traced, I need to cut it out. Now, if it's too hard for you to cut out 2 pieces of poster board, well then cut out one, take that one, trace it onto your second piece, and cut it out. I have extremely strong hands, however, so I'm going to go ahead and cut both pieces of paper out at the same time. Now I need to add the top and the bottom to my heart, almost creating what's going to look like a candy box of hearts. This part can be a little bit tricky because this is not stable and you need to make that kind of fit, but you're going to end up with some little gaps. So I'm going to show you a couple of tricks to make this work. Your first step will be to take either of your hearts that you cut out and put a bunch of tabs or pieces of tape around the edges. So I'm putting tape on here so half of it is on the heart and the other half is hanging off. And I'm using some pretty thick pieces of masking tape. I don't need to cover all of the spots. I'm just getting big spans of empty area filled in with tape. So now that I've got that done, I'm going to take my paper heart and lay it on top of my edges of my heart, just like this. And one spot at a time, I'm just going to gently fold this down. And the reason I'm doing it gently is because the sides still want to push in. So if I press too hard, it will cause these sides to cave in. So I'm just doing it gently. All right, now that I've got that done pretty gently, now I can go back and put one hand inside and press a little bit more firmly. And that's making sure I don't lose my support. So first step was to do it gently, and then you can go back and press down the tape firmly. You don't want tape sticking up. Now take a look at your heart. You do have some empty spots or some gaps. So now I'm going to fill those in with tape also. So I'm just taking my tape, any place I see a gap. Doesn't have to be a closed gap because the tape is filling in that extra space. So I don't have to worry about pushing this in. Just going to let the tape fill in any gaps. So any empty spaces I see or any places that didn't get tape, I will just secure them. Piece of cake, so very easy. Oh, there's one right there, and I can tell because my heart wants to cave in a little bit. There we go. Now that I've got this side done, I'm ready to do the other side. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm doing the same thing. I'm just putting a bunch of tabs of tape around the edges. Okay, now I have created my armature. My armature is complete. I'm just doing a little bit of a pressure test, just pushing on it to see did I miss any places where it's going to cave in, because it now needs to be strong enough to support the weight and the wetness of plaster. So now that this is finished, find a small place on the tape to gently write your name and teacher code. Don't press too hard. I think you understand why. And then we will work on covering this in plaster. To cover our hearts, we're going to use plaster. The plaster we're using is the same kind of plaster that's used, it's plaster wrap, used in a medical or a doctor's office when you break a bone. So if you've ever broken an arm or a leg and this looks familiar to you, well, now you know why. It's the exact same stuff. It's a piece of gauze or a piece of fabric that's been dipped in plaster. So you'll even see when you get it that there's one side that's very lumpy and bumpy where a lot of the plaster is, and there's another side that's a little bit more smooth. You are going to want to use the side that's a lot more lumpy and bumpy when you place it on your heart armature. So your first step though is to get this wet. So you're going to have 3 containers on your table. One to keep your heart in because plaster can be very messy and dusty. We want to try to keep this as contained as possible. So you're going to keep your heart while you're working inside of your tin. The other thing you're going to need are plaster strips and some water. We're going to keep the plaster and the water separated because if this gets wet and then it's allowed to dry, it will become rock hard. You only want to use one piece at a time. Otherwise, you'd end up wasting pieces of plaster. So take one piece at a time. You'll dip it in your water just for a moment, and then you're going to take it out, and it's very drippy and wet. We don't want it to be this wet when we put it on our heart armature. It might cause it to cave in. So I'm going to take my fingers like a pair of scissors, and I'm just going to scissor my fingers down the plaster, and that'll also help smooth the plaster out while I'm squeegeeing or squishing the water out of it. So now I've got my plaster strip. just straighten it out. It's going to feel like wet paper, and lay it on there. And what I'm going to do is create an X. So I'm going to put one there, and then just like clay, smooth it with my fingers. I shouldn't have any parts sticking up, just like with the tape. I'm making sure to smooth it down. I'm going to take another piece, only one piece at a time, put it in the water. I'm having my fingers tap dance on it for just a moment to kind of wake up that plaster. Squeegee it with my scissor fingers. And I'll do that once more because I can tell it's pretty wet. Open it back up. And I said I was creating an X. So I'm going to go ahead and drape that just like this. And I'm making sure to smooth it as I go. And I definitely want it to go over the edges since I'm covering the entire thing. Now I'm just looking at my heart and I'm seeing that I don't have too many places left to cover. Just a couple of edges peeking through. That's good. It won't take us very long. If you start with that X, it's really going to cover up most of your heart. So now I'm going to overlap some pieces. I'll put one right there to cover up that big area that had some parts of the armature still showing. Smooth it with my fingers, letting it drape over the edge. If it's like a fold right there, just smooth it down the best you can. It's okay if some of the plaster overlaps a little bit. And when you're finished with one side of your heart, we're going to flip it over and do the exact same thing. We cannot have any parts of that armature exposed or showing. And right now I'm trying to figure out how to best cover the top of this heart. It looks like this piece is so long it's going to go ahead and go over to the other side, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, now that I have both sides covered, I'm now going to check the edges because I see I have some little peekaboo spots where some of the armature is sticking out. And it is okay if you overlap a couple of pieces of plaster one on top of the other. In fact, it will make your sculpture a lot stronger. So it's all right if you already have plaster in some places. It's more important to make sure that you are completely covering your armature. Also, you want to make sure to keep smoothing down those parts. Anything you don't smooth down is going to dry rock hard just like that. So it's just like when you're working with clay, making sure that you have everything nice and smooth down. It's okay if the plaster kind of overlaps and folds over on itself as long as everything is smooth. Okay, so I'm still checking for any places where my armature is showing to cover that. And when I'm finished covering all the places of my armature, I need to let the plaster strips dry. All this water needs to evaporate. And this fabric, which feels very fluid, is going to turn rock hard, just like on a cast. And then we'll be able to add paint and the words to our conversation or candy heart. So you'll need to be thinking about what you want your heart to say. Plaster wrap on my heart has dried. I'm ready to paint. So let's talk about the colors of candy hearts. Candy hearts are pastel in color, meaning they are light colors. To make a color light, you must add white. When you make a color light, it is called a tint. In the tasty flavors of candy hearts, there are grape, banana, lemon, orange. There's also cherry and wintergreen. So be thinking about what color you might want to make your heart. And I have decided to go with banana. So I have gotten the primary color yellow and white because I know to make it light, I must have white. And when you make a color light, it is called a tint. So on my palette here, I'm going to scoop up some paint, flip it over. I'm starting with white because I want this to be a very light color. And now I have my primary color of yellow, and I'm not going to add nearly as much because I can always add more. I'm going to mix this up, and I think that looks like a pretty good tint of yellow. The key is, though, you need to make a lot of it because you have a pretty big surface to cover. So I'm going to go ahead and make more, adding white to make it light. If I add more white, it will become lighter in what's called value. Value is the lightness and darkness of color. So if I continue to add white, it will become lighter in value. If I want it to become more colorful, then I will just go ahead and add more yellow. So when you think you've got the color that you like, you can go ahead and paint your heart. And I'm painting the entire surface. The surface is not smooth, so when you rub it or take your brush across it, you're going to notice that it leaves a texture. We want to make sure that we fill in all of those white spots. So I'm almost kind of scrubbing the paint onto the surface of my heart. I'm going to do the front, the back, and the sides. Now that you've painted your candy heart and it's dried, you're ready to go ahead and start adding the words to your candy heart. But before you do that, it's good to plan ahead. So after you've decided what you want your candy or conversation heart to say, you're going to have a sheet like this. There are tons of different sayings that the Necco company has used over the years. In fact, every year they add new sayings to their candy hearts. Think of something that you would like your candy heart to say that is both sweet, kind, and positive. I'm going to go with love bug. So I'm going to go ahead and write that here. That way I can check my spelling and I know exactly how to get those words on there correctly. I don't want to have anything misspelled on my candy heart. So the reason you have a sheet like this that has one section and then two is because you need to decide, is what you're going to say short enough that you can fit it on one line, or is it so long that you need to write it out on two? And you'll notice that this has a top line and a bottom line because your letters have to go from the top of the line to the bottom of the line. What I want you to do is make sure whatever you're saying is that you practice it both here and dividing it in two just to see which one you think is going to look better. So I'm going to go with love bug. I know that I want my letters to be from here, from the top line to the bottom line, but I also want them to be centered. This is the center of my heart. How do I find the center of my words? Well, what I'm going to do is count them. I'm going to give the L a 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm counting the space, 5, 6, 7, and 8. What I need to do is divide this in half, which for me would be about the number 4, and between the 4 and the 5. So that tells me that the E is about the halfway point. It's in the middle of the saying love bug. And that also tells me what letter is going to be in the center here. So I'm going to very lightly pencil it in, and I know I want my E to go from the top all the way down to the bottom. I know I need to leave a little bit of a space just so that it doesn't end up looking like one word. And I'm just sketching this in, and I have to really stretch those letters out. And this is going to take some practice because you need to make sure that the letters are tall and wide enough to be read. Let's see if I can get all the letters in there. It looks like I'm really going to have to squeeze. I might even have to erase. So this is what it would look like if I went with one line. Let's see how it would look if I went with two lines. So now I have this, love and bug. Looks like this is definitely going to be in the middle, the U, and somewhere in between the O and the V is the middle. Remember, find the middle because you want your words to be centered. Okay, so I'm going to start with my U. My G, making sure to go from the top all the way down to the bottom. You'll notice I'm also using all caps or all capital letters. That's usually how they appear on a conversation or a candy heart. There's my O, V. Now it gives me a little bit more area to spread my letters out. Okay, I think I like the way this one looks better. This one might be a little tricky when I go to add it to my heart. So now that I've found the one that I like, I need to make this magically appear on there. So how to do that? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn my paper over, and on the back of my paper where my words are, only my words, I'm going to use my pencil and I'm going to color very, very hard. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. Okay, I'm going to place this right on top of here. And to secure it, you might want to tape it. I think I'm just going to hold it with my hand. And now what I'm going to do is use my pencil again and press firmly, trace over my letters. So, using a teeny tiny paintbrush and painting very carefully, I'm going to go ahead and start painting over the letters that I have decided on. And I've got red and I've got pink. I'm going to use a nice small brush. And I'm painting over my letters slowly and carefully. Now that I'm all done painting in red, the final touch for me will be to add a little bit of a highlight with some pink and maybe even some white. So I'm going to start with pink, and I'm just going to paint kind of over the red a little bit, maybe just next to it a little bit. This will add a little bit of variety, and it'll also make the letters pop and stand out a little bit more and make them a little bit thicker so they're not so small and hard to read. So again, I'm not painting over the red. I'm just kind of, going over it a tiny bit, kind of outlining it a little bit, just adding a little bit of variety to the color. You can add it, not on the whole letter if you don't want to, but just even in some parts. And now I'm just going to add a little bit of white. You don't have to if you don't want to. I just wanted to add a little bit of variety and maybe even make it look a little bit more 3D. I'm just putting it on the tops of my heart and then maybe a little bit on the side. Well, boys and girls, now that my conversation heart is complete, I cannot wait to see how yours turns out. Let's go on this amazing adventure of making some fantastical pop art inspired conversation or candy hearts.